All right, we are in James chapter 3, verses 1 to 12 today. The main point of James is from James chapter 1, verse 22, where James says, prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude themselves. James's whole point is we must act on our faith. Now, he doesn't write to convince people to believe in Christ and what they should believe, because he talks about that they're in chapter 2, verse 1, their faith in the glorious Lord Jesus. He knows that they have faith. He knows that they know what they believe, but he writes to convince them to act on their faith. Not works of law to make themselves right. It has nothing to do with making ourselves right and earning our way to heaven, but works of faith in response to God making us right because of the sacrifice of Jesus. Just as a quick review, in the first chapter, James writes that trials should be welcomed as opportunities to grow in faith. Yay. And then if we need help, to pray to God with confidence for his wisdom. And then he contrasts temptations. Now, temptations are not the same as trials. James writes that temptations come from within. Temptations come along because we are focused on what we want. And right after, wouldn't you know it, right after focusing that temptations are focused on what we want and are from inward, he addresses speech. He talks about being quick to hear, slow to speak, that a hearer is also a doer, and that a truly religious person controls their speech and focuses on meeting the needs of others. And then chapter 2, verse 8, he says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. He often repeats Jesus. I haven't gone through and seen just how many different times he repeats Jesus, but this is really just kind of an expansion on the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said in Matthew 7:12, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Just as something repeating what he as God said in Leviticus 19:18. So he's not saying this new thing. And in chapter 2, the last half, James uses the example of Abraham and Rahab to prove in verse 17, even so faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. Well, now he's going to quit preaching and go to meddling. He's going to he's already stepped on toes, and now he's just going to kind of stomp on them. In chapter 3, verses 1 to 12, he talks about the danger of our speech. And the theme is from chapter 1, verse 26. If anyone appears to be religious, but cannot control his tongue, he deceives himself. And we may be sure that his religion is useless. That's some pretty harsh words, and he's going to point out why in these first 12 verses. Now, James uses an amazing number of word pictures. I mean, as I read through James and keep reading through James, I can just see in my imagination the word pictures that he uses. In chapter 1, verse 6, he talks about the doubter being like the surf of the sea. Anybody who's been at the ocean when things are a little bit rough, I mean, it is pounding. You don't even step out when it's really pounding like that, because it'll knock you over. Chapter 123, being like a hearer only, is like looking in a mirror and forgetting what needs to be fixed. It's kind of like, okay, I looked in the mirror and I'm going to walk away and ignore the frizzy hair and the broccoli in my teeth. He says it doesn't make sense to just be a hearer. He describes in chapter 2 the rich man and the poor man. The way he describes them, you can just kind of picture them walking in and how they're dressed and how they look and how they're received. You can just kind of see that. You can just see that scene acted out. And he describes the neighbor's needs and the uselessness of responding without actions. You know, it's like, hey, have a good night. Hope you're warm. Hope you have plenty to eat. And then he talks about Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and no parent can read through that and not really just, wow, that's the struggle that Abraham must have had. I mean, it's not just the struggle when he got there. I mean, just the heartache and the struggle all the way up until that point. Rahab and her faith in protecting the spies. I mean, that's a spy story. When the spies go in and they're spying out the land, and this woman of ill repute, she saves them and she protects them and hides them, and that's a really cool story. And so he brings up that one for his point there. And we see each of these is used with an audience who knows all of this, who has who lived by the sea, who knew the history, the story of Abraham and of Rahab, and he uses those stories, those picture stories, to get his point across to his audience. And now he's going to describe the destructive power of our words. Yes.
Those things that he brings up, although that people may not know about Abraham, but people can relate to a man
yes.
who would sacrifices and can relate to someone who has been to the sea and seen the power of it. And all these things appeal to us as you said, as pictures.
Yes.
It's so very current.
Yes, because again, he's writing to probably a Jewish audience, Jewish Christians, because it was early in the church, and so they would know exactly what happened with Abraham, with Rahab. Now let's go ahead and read James chapter 3, verses 1 to 12.
7 to 12. Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur a stricter judgment, for we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. Now, if we put the bits into horses' mouths so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. Look at the ships also, though they are so great and are driven by strong winds, are still directed by a very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body, and sets on fire the course of our life, and is set on fire by hell.
Go ahead, Cheryl.
For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of man, of God. Out of the mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus, no spring yields both salt water and fresh.
Thank you. All right, so the first thing he says is something that has always just kind of brought me up short. Not many of you should be teachers. I say this because, as you know, we who teach will be judged more strictly than others. And I was talking to Sam this morning, and I've been teaching some form of Bible class for about 32 years. And I'm kind of like, and then he goes into the next verse and he guarantees that I will have misspoken probably multiple times in doing that, because in verse 2 he says we all stumble in many ways when we're speaking. I try, but this has always concerned me, because again, any teacher, we have the responsibility that we're, especially with children, that we have the responsibility of souls. And I don't want anyone to stand before God and say, but Kathy said, like, and I was in the habit, and I haven't done it as much here, but I was in the habit in Albuquerque. It's kind of like, especially when I started teaching ladies class a few years back. If you hear me say anything that is not right, you throw a shoe at me. Well, preferably not throw a shoe at me, but speak up right then, immediately. And I trust y'all to, I don't feel like I have to say it here. I trust y'all to speak up immediately. It's like, that's not it. So, but I need that, because James guarantees that we will stumble. We who teach will stumble, we'll mess up, we'll misspeak. And it's kind of like, I'll say one thing, it's kind of like, that's what, let me back up, let me say what I actually meant. And I've had to do that. Hopefully I catch myself. But I got to thinking about this. This doesn't just apply. I mean, he's applying this to those who would teach about Christ, but it applies to teachers. Imagine, just think of the influence that teachers, public school teachers, private, just any teachers of our children have on our kids. Probably all of us can remember one of our teachers from way back when who had an influence on us. Miss Talitha for me, geometry, she was awfully sweet. Mr. Marshall, really nice guy. And then remembering those who weren't so good. And especially now that we see, parents are getting really involved because they're seeing things that are being taught to kids it's just not right. It's divisive, it's damaging to kids. And when you see kids come out of colleges, sometimes I was pretty nervous. We sent Sarah to a Christian college, but it's kind of like, I was still a little nervous about what is she going to hear there, because I've even seen an interview one time, one of these, we're going to talk to kids on campuses. And they say, well, I used to think this, but then I came to college and I learned better. And I'm kind of like, did you really? No, you just, you just opened up your mind and just took whatever was shoveled in there. And it wasn't shoveling from a good place. But again, the judgment of teachers, because those minds, the authority and the position, people take your word for it more. And it's kind of like, I'm kind of like, oh no, I'm just a conduit for hopefully, for what I've studied. Nothing should originate with me. And if I'm saying my opinion, I will say right out, this is my opinion. And so I really try to keep that separate and like, don't listen to my opinion. This is what I think. But just the influence that teachers have, the influence that we have, and we all have an example. I mean, I remember as a high schooler, someone telling my mom, oh, your kids are such a good example of my kid. And I'm kind of like, what? I don't know your kid. And yet we teach all the time. And that stricter judgment. So not only answering for my life, but for those I have taught. That's pretty nervy. But then again, I'll share that burden with y'all because we all teach. We are all an example of what people see as Christian. And it's kind of like, do they see Christian in us when we are speaking with them, when we're around them? Matthew 23, verses 2 and 3, please.
I'm looking for number 2.
You can start with 1. It's fine.
You're not going to believe this, but this,
Start with verse 1 then.
then Jesus spoke to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do.
Oh, now that's and then he's going to go on and say, woe to these teachers. And he's talking about teachers. And he told the people to listen to them, do what they say, because they're teaching right. And that's the thing. They're teaching the right thing, but they don't practice what they preach. We've heard that. But since their actions are wrong, he's going to spend the next, from starting in verse 13, he's going to go on and say, woe to them. And that idea of woe, there is a declaration of God's judgment, because even though they taught what was right, they didn't live it. They lived wrong. And so their example was wrong. Jesus says, ignore their example. Now that's really hard, isn't it? When you've got the example of one thing, but the words of a different thing, that's really hard to separate. And Jesus saying, no, you've got to do that. You as the student have to do that. That's your responsibility. But they are not doing what's right, and they're facing judgment for that. He calls them hypocrites, blind, and he says that they're teaching what's right. He doesn't have any problem with what they're teaching, but he calls them hypocrites, blind guides, fools, and snakes, because they didn't do what was right. There were priests that were supposed to teach God's law during the time of Hosea. In Hosea chapter 4, verse 1 and verse 2, God says, for there is no faithfulness, nor loyalty, nor knowledge of God in the land. There were priests at that time, but there was no knowledge of God in the land. And instead of acting faithfully to God, the people were, according to verse 2, cursing, lying, killing, stealing, and committing adultery. Oh, look around today. It's kind of like, do we know God, or are we doing these other things? And in Hosea 4, verse 6, God says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Teachers do have a responsibility. The student has a lot of responsibility, and there's that influence that James is talking about, that as we have an influence on others, regardless of who it is, it may be the person in the drive-through that or that an order is messed up. We had that this week twice. Our pickup order at the grocery store is messed up, and we're telling the person who's apologizing, it's not your fault, but this is a problem. It's continuing to be a problem, but we know it's not your fault. And so how are we responding to people? What kind of influence, what do they see in us? What kind of influence do we have? Because we all have an influence on people. Any comments on this section? I haven't even gotten out of verse 1. All right, we got to pick up the pace here. Verse 2, right after talking about teachers, he's going to say, we all make all kinds of mistakes. Like, yeah, yeah, I do. He says, but the one who can claim to have never said anything wrong is perfect, because if you can control your speech, then you can control all of yourself. Well, I don't control all of myself, and I certainly don't control all of my speech. And that is troubling what he says there, that yeah, he pretty much guarantees, and you know, he guarantees that, you know, we have all, and when he says that, he says we all stumble in many ways. It's kind of okay. So none of us have, Jesus never did, but he's the only one that never stumbled in what he said. But James has said where the problem with our speech comes from, and the mistakes happen in verse 1 to verse 6 when we ask for wisdom but do so with doubting. That when we decide to blame God, when we're tempted, chapter 1 verse 13, that when we're angry with each other, chapter 1 verse 19, all of these things are how we're talking and the mistakes that we're making when we're talking. Chapter 1 verse 26, that, you know, deceiving ourselves and thinking, you know, hey, I'm pretty religious, but I don't have to control what I say. And that when we don't speak and act as Christ's followers, as he had addressed in chapter 2. So all of those things, that speech that we're in the habit of doing leads us to make mistakes in how we treat each other. Any comments as we're going along here? Okay. Verse 3 to 6, he talks about the power of the tongue. There are so many times, if I could just, and sometimes I do catch myself, but when the times I, you know, Sam and I get into an argument is when I just didn't stop. It's kind of, you know, I could just stop right now, but I don't stop because doggone it, I'm right. And it's just stop, think about what I'm going to be saying. And those times, rare as they are, but those times I can do that, things just kind of smooth over. And I'm sure Sam feels the exact same way. It's kind of like, you know, boy, if she would just stop talking. No, but again, if we can control what we say. And he gives these examples here. How many have ridden horses? Cool. So y'all know that a horse, it weighs between 900 and 2,000 pounds. Those things are big and they're strong. I mean, you know how big and strong they are if you've been around them. But the bit is about yay but wide, about that big around. It's little for this 2015. I mean, the horse I rode as a teenager was 1,500 pounds. And I, believe it or not, I was the size of Sarah. There was no way I was in charge of that horse. And in fact, I remember one time he was, and this is, well, should I say this example? Well, he was kind of rubbing himself against the fence and my sister got her leg trapped. Well, I was trying to push him off and I couldn't move him. There was just, I mean, he didn't even notice me going, get, you know, stop that. You know, he didn't even notice. Again, I was the size of Sarah. So he didn't even notice that, but you put the bit in his mouth and I knew he would go where I wanted, not where he wanted. He would do what I wanted, not what he wanted, because of that control. And now I don't know a whole lot about ships. I don't know if anybody in here does know, but I looked things up. And Google is good for a few things. There's some complicated physics in figuring out the size of a rudder and what it does, because it doesn't actually turn. It just kind of, it kind of turns, it kind of turns in kind of funny, wonky way. Anyway, I looked it all up, but it's kind of interesting. I got distracted. That was my rabbit this week. But the rudder is apparently 2 to 4% of the underwater profile area. That is the area that's underwater. The size of the rudder is 2 to 4% of that. That's little. I mean, picture a cruise ship. Now, I couldn't find the exact size of a rudder, but I saw a picture of one. So picture a cruise ship that's about 1,000 feet long. That's about the length of a football field. About 30 feet of that height of a cruise ship is underneath water, 30 feet underwater. And I looked at the picture of a rudder. It looked like it wasn't more than about 10 feet high. Little, 2 to 4% of that area that's underwater, little thing. And yet it turns the ship. And like I said, there's complicated physics to where it's okay, you know, it doesn't quite turn. It kind of, it's complicated, but it's really cool. But that little thing controls the ship, this huge ship. I know, and that's the word picture that James uses, that horse that's controlled by the bit that's about that big, and the rudder or the ship that's controlled by the rudder that's only about 2 to 4% of what's underneath water, let alone what, you know, most of it's above water. So it's such a tiny part of it.
Would be good if we had a bit to go in.
You know, I think, oh, I should have looked this one up. I think there's actually a verse that, you know, like, you know, cover my mouth, Lord. I think it's one of the Proverbs or Psalms of David, you know, actually literally cover my mouth. You know, if that could just happen when I needed it to, then yeah, I would be pretty close to perfect right there.
One time, one of my grandchildren, who was about 3 or 4 years old, said, Granny, stop and think and breathe. That's what Blue's Clues says.
That's
I
great.
slapped that kid.
I know.
No, you
Yeah.
taught me.
I know. And if you just slow down, there were times that with my kids, it's kind of like, stop, listen to what they're saying. Still don't like what they're saying, but it's kind of like, okay. Verse 5 talks about the tongue being that small part of the body, yet it boasts of great things. Behold, how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. Anybody that has seen fire or, living in Albuquerque, we saw the smoke from a lot of the fires that were coming across. I remember driving up from Southern California to Northern, and the side of the hill was just on fire. It's kind of like, great. But again, that fire that is just so destructive. It is such a small part of our body, but how many verses in the Bible are about our arrogance and our rebellion and the damage that comes from speech? Just 2 of them, just because there are hundreds. Proverbs 26 verses 17 to 28 lists the incredible damage of that our words can have, and it concludes in verse 28: a lying tongue hates those it crushes, and the flattering mouth works ruin. Like, but I didn't mean anything. And there's actually a proverb about that, so it's kind of like, like arrows from a arrows shot at a neighbor is one who says, I was just joking, I was just kidding, after they've done something. In Matthew 12 verse 34 to 37, Jesus declares that our words reveal our character, who we really are. Verse 34 says, for the mouth speaks out of that which fills the heart. So if I'm speaking anger, I can say all day long that, I don't have anger in my heart. But if my words come out and I'm angry all the time, that's what's in my heart. If it's bitterness that's coming out, that's what's in my heart. Jesus said so. That's not from me. That's not my opinion. That is what Jesus said, that what comes out of your mouth will show what is in your heart, whether it's anger, bitterness, or love, or kindness. I've told y'all about the 2 older ladies that I don't remember their names now, but they had lasting influence on me when I was at college age, early 20s. One of them, nicest little old lady, she sat with us college age, and she got along with a walker, and I never saw family visit her, yet if you asked her how she was doing, she said, I'm just blessed to be here. That was always her answer. She never told me what was going on with her other than, I'm just so blessed to be here. And the other lady, and apparently we got asked to pick her up because nobody wanted to pick her up, because she sat in the back seat and muttered the most nasty things about the people she was going to be with and that she loved, but boy, she muttered nasty things about them. Like, oh, it was so uncomfortable. But again, she lost that filter, and I know my filter is going to go. It's kind of, I sure hope what's in here is awful sweet by the time that filter goes, because it's going to come out. But again, those, are we in control of our speech? Or are we controlled by our speech? And he talks about the difficulty of taming the tongue, that everything else in this world can be tamed. I mean, orcas are trained to jump on command. I mean, incredible things. Horses that weigh 2,000 pounds, that's still a bit more than I weigh right now, can be controlled by that tiny little bit. All these things can be controlled, he says in verse 7, but no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. And when I think of some of the things I have said, once you ring that bell, once it's out of your mouth, you can't take it back. You can apologize all day long, but it's been said.
That's something that is very important to learn and remember. Once something comes out of your
Yep.
mouth, you cannot take it back. It's there.
Yeah.
No matter how much you apologize.
Yep.
It's still gonna be out there.
Yep. There's one thing Sam and I determined when we were first married: never, ever, ever call each other names. Never. I'm not going to say that we've been 100%, but we've been like 99.9% on that. And that makes that really helps, because it's kind of, okay, I've got plenty to apologize for, but I don't have to apologize for calling you names because I didn't do it. I controlled that one thing at least. But we're in verse 8, he says that the tongue is a restless evil. I mean, you ever feel restless when you're, I want to say this. Boy, I have a right to say this. I know I'm right. and you can just feel it just fighting to get out. That restless evil. Romans chapter 3, Paul quotes from a bunch of different Psalms to show that we have all sinned with actions and with words. In verse 13, he says, their throat is an open grave, that with their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. I mean, that is our tongue. That is what's in our mouth and really trying to get out. We've got to control what's in our heart.
And these days it's text.
Oh, yeah.
messages, too.
And it's so anonymous that's kind of like, oh, I can just say anything.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of like, oh, it doesn't really matter because there's not a real person. Yeah, it's still real people. And I think especially when we've been just staying at home all the time, it's kind of, you know, then get out and interact with people again. And then people are just brawling on airplanes and just, you know, not being able to just calmly deal with each other. We can't, you know, the Bible says, come, let us reason together. And we just kind of, seems like as a society that we're kind of skipping right over that to throwing punches. John Wesley was a 17th century clergyman. And the story goes that a woman once came to John Wesley and said she knew what her talent was. And she said, I think my talent from God is to speak my mind. And John Wesley replied, I don't think God would mind if you buried that talent. But again, it is so important to control what we say. They can do immeasurable, permanent harm. I just Googled, you know, the harm of verbal abuse on children. And what they said was that it actually changes something in the brain chemistry. And I'm kind of like, whoa. I mean, if for a little bitty child whose brain is still changing and developing, that there is an actual change and that they can actually measure that as an adult. And that's brand new stuff. So that may be witch doctor stuff, but you know, when you see adults who have been in that situation, they have a hard time. Their first response is not what someone else's first response is who hasn't had that. It's hard. We say, so we've got to be able to control what we say. Small children, I mean, especially take things so seriously. And from teachers, just, I mean, even, you know, school teachers and so forth, just take it, I mean, that is just so serious. And I know, you know, anybody who has a kid or a grandkid that is in a tough situation where the teachers are just, you know, got to get them out. I mean, my mom did that one time with my brother because the teacher was convinced that my brother needed to be held back, and my mom's like, no, he just doesn't like you. And so they bumped him up a grade. They bumped him up to 3rd grade, and he did great. But he did not like her. And I don't know how they got crosswise or anything like that. He was in the 2nd grade. I have no idea, but he didn't like her, and so they bumped him up to 3rd grade, and he took off and did fantastic. So you know, teachers make a difference. And then in verses 9 to 12, that contradictory nature of the tongue. The verse 10 says, from the same mouth come both blessing and cursing, my brethren, these things ought not to be this way. And I'm sure he's talking about his own frustration, because Paul talks about his frustration there too. It's kind of like, I know what I want to do. I know how I want to be. And yet James says that we all stumble in so many ways, especially with what we say. And I know now I'm not admitting anything, but as an example, one can literally be driving along, listening to the Christian radio, singing along to those gospel songs, and then someone cuts us off. And they are the sorriest so-and-so that ever walked the earth. And it's just kind of like, wait a minute, just a second ago, God is great. And now about this person. Not that I have ever done that, you know, but again, it just flips so fast, and it's just like our tongue just takes off. And it's kind of like, I had to be really careful when my kids started driving. I'm kind of like, where did you learn to growl about drivers? It's like, from listening to me growl about bad drivers, because, you know, it wouldn't be anything bad, but it was going to say, I can't believe that person just did that. And I'm kind of like, where did they get all that grumpy from? I know where they got that grumpy from. So it's kind of okay. So it's kind of control that. Sarah, when she was 18, when she was like less than 2, she started grunting when she would get up. Like, where did that come from? Okay, shush when I get up, because they pick up on these things. And so she of course, I'm saying she exaggerated, but she would, oh, when she would stand up. Oh my goodness, My excuse is I was 36 when I had her, but again, but I decided to control. I didn't even notice that. I did not notice that I was verbalizing that, but she picked up on it and ran with it, and so I started controlling that. But again, I mean, especially children pick everything up that we say and that we do. I mean, they are watching. When you hear Luke, who knows the order of worship, who knows our names, who knows to say amen, he is listening, he is watching all of us. And that right there is an amazing, I mean, and he's going to watch if we start going rare at each other. Like, oh, that's how we act in church. You know, he's watching that. He's watching, are we loving each other? Are we speaking with each other kindly or not? Or are we just, you know, ready to go, you know, at each other, which we're not. I think we're a good influence there. But again, those little children, they will pick up on that just instantly.
My dad picked up my son one day when he was 3. And something happened in traffic. I don't know what. But my dad said he heard this little boy say, God heard you. He said, God heard me.
Yep. My daughter, when she was, I don't even think she was 2, but she was, you know, scribbling on something, and it was Sunday morning, and the preacher, and I didn't think she was listening, but the preacher said something about the Bible, which was right. But no, mommy, the Bible is God's word, because he didn't say that. And it's kind of like, okay, little 2-year-old is listening. But they do, they listen and they parrot things and they think about these things, and it affects who they are. Now, she's not going to remember that 20 years later, but it is going to affect her development and who she developed to be. All those things that she heard. All right, any other comments as we're finishing up here? Okay. James 1:26 says, if anyone appears to be religious but cannot control his tongue, he deceives himself, and we may be sure that his religion is useless. And then now James is talking about, you know, he's talking about controlling how we deal with each other and act toward each other. And now he's gone to meddling and is talking about how we talk to each other. And he uses these word pictures to describe the destructive power of our words, that the horses and ships are controlled by this small, tiny thing in comparison, and that we are controlled by our tongue. And it's just so easy for words to just trip out before we even think about it. But the tongue is a forest fire, it's poison, it's confusing and contradictory, like fresh and bitter water from the same source. I mean, if you're saying nice things to someone and then 2 seconds later you're you know, grousing at them, they're kind of like, whoa, that is confusing. You know, and to be in control there, as confusing as getting olives from a fig tree, that would be really weird. Or getting, you know, if I got okra from my tomato plant, that would be really confusing. But again, that's as confusing as someone saying, oh, nice, nice, and then turning around and stabbing you in the back when they go to talk to you about somebody else. It happens, and it shouldn't. Jesus says that what is in our hearts will come out in what we say, Matthew 12:34. And James has already said what we have to do to be in control of what's in our hearts. Unfortunately, in James 1, verse 19, he says to be in control of what's in our hearts, we have to control our anger, to get that anger out of our hearts. That we have to be more like Christ. We have to be willing to study and to look at our lives and look at the life of Christ and change what needs to be changed. Chapter 1, verse 25. To be in control of what's in our hearts, we must love our neighbors as ourselves. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 13. To be in control of what's in our hearts, we must live our lives focused on acting as Christ followers. James chapter 2, starting in verse 14. And so this is all building up. This is all one thing. So when you're reading James, I really encourage, read the whole thing. Because he talks about these actions. And if you're controlling these actions and you're controlling what's happening in your attitudes, that's going to change what's in your heart, and that's going to change what comes out of your mouth. And if we control our minds, control our hearts, we will go a very long way to controlling our words. Because our goal is to be perfect like our Heavenly Father is perfect, and we cannot be if we're not controlling what we're saying. I'm going to go ahead. We're going to finish a little early even. Matthew 12, verse 35 to 38. I'm going to finish with the words of Jesus here, if there's any more comments. Y'all are quiet this morning. I wonder why. Just leave me on the spot, huh? Let her say it all. Yeah. Let her say it all and stick her foot in her mouth. But I'm going to finish with Jesus' words in Matthew 12, starting in verse 35. The good person brings out of his good treasure good things, and the evil person brings out of his evil treasure evil things. If I'm saying evil things, then that's what's in here. But I tell you that for every careless word that people speak, they will give an account of it on the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. Those are the words of Christ, and those are serious. And James here is expounding on that we've got to be in control, and to be in control of what comes out of our mouth, we have to be in control of what's in our hearts. Thank you so much for your time and for your comments.